You're in the shower, and suddenly you're mid-conversation with someone who isn't there. Maybe it's your coworker, and you're finally saying the thing you didn't say in the meeting. Maybe it's a stranger who cut you off in traffic 4 days ago, and you're delivering the perfect cutting line you never got to say in the moment. Your jaw is tight, your hands are gesturing at nothing, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a small, quiet part of you notices what's happening and thinks, why am I doing this again? You're not talking to anyone, there's no one in the room, and yet you just spent 10 minutes having an entire argument, complete with tone of voice, timing, even their reaction to what you said. What is that, and why does it feel so real while it's happening? Most people assume this is just overthinking, a bad mental habit, something to be embarrassed about. But it isn't random, and it isn't a flaw. It's one of the most consistent behaviors across the entire species, so consistent that researchers have a name for it: imaginary interaction. And once you understand what it's actually doing, you'll never look at your own daydreams the same way again. Here's the first surprising fact. This isn't wasted mental energy. Your brain doesn't run expensive processes for no reason. Attention, emotion, memory retrieval, language generation, all firing at once for a conversation that will never happen, unless that process is earning its keep somehow. So what's the payoff? Rehearsal. Your brain is practicing a version of your life before it happens. Think about a boxer shadowboxing before a real fight. No opponent in front of him, but every punch, every duck, every pivot is real training for real stakes. His muscles are learning timing and range without the risk of getting hit. Your mind does the exact same thing with words. Every imagined conversation is a kind of shadowboxing for your social life, testing arguments, testing tone, testing what happens if you say the risky thing out loud. This is why the conversations you replay aren't random. They cluster around two categories: moments that already went wrong, and moments you're afraid are about to. Let's start with the ones that already happened. You said something in a meeting, and afterward, on the drive home, you replay it 5 different ways, each one slightly more articulate, slightly more confident than what actually came out of your mouth. This isn't nostalgia, it's damage control. Somewhere in your mind, that moment got flagged as unfinished, not because the conversation literally continues, but because your sense of how it landed is unresolved. Did they think I was rude? Did I sound stupid? Your brain doesn't like leaving that question open, so it keeps generating alternate endings, hoping one of them will finally feel resolved enough to let go. This connects to something psychologists have observed for almost a century, that unfinished tasks occupy far more mental space than completed ones. A conversation that ended cleanly gets archived. A conversation that ended with any ambiguity, a joke that didn't land, a silence that felt too long, a text that got left unread, stays active, like a notification badge your brain refuses to clear. And here's the twist. Your brain doesn't actually need the real person to clear that badge. It just needs a version of resolution, even a fake one. So it builds one, over and over, which is why you can win the same imaginary argument 15 times and still feel unsettled. Because deep down, some part of you knows the real one never got the ending you keep writing. Now the second category, the conversations that haven't happened yet. You're about to ask for a raise. You're about to tell a friend something they won't want to hear. You're about to go on a first date with someone you actually like, which somehow feels more nerve-wracking than a job interview. In the hours before, your mind starts running drafts. What if they say this? Then I'll say that. What if they get defensive? Then I'll stay calm and say this instead. This is your brain doing something remarkable, and something almost no other species can do to this degree, mentally time-traveling into a moment that doesn't exist yet, in order to prepare for it as if it already does. Neuroscientists sometimes describe this as pulling the future into the present so you can rehearse your reaction to it in advance, at zero real-world cost. It's the same reason airline pilots train for engine failure in a simulator instead of waiting for it to happen mid-flight for the first time. When the real moment arrives, the brain isn't starting from zero, it already has a rough draft loaded, which is often exactly why the real conversation feels calmer than you expected. Not because you got lucky, but because some part of you had already lived through 3 or 4 versions of it beforehand. But here's where it gets more complicated, because this system has a flaw baked right into its design. Your brain, when simulating a future conversation, doesn't have full information. It doesn't actually know what the other person will say, so it fills in the blanks using the most available material it has, which is usually your own fears, your own past experiences, your own worst-case assumptions, which means the version of your boss you're arguing with in your head at 2 a.m. isn't really your boss. It's a puppet built out of your anxiety, wearing your boss's face. This matters, because it explains something that trips a lot of people up: why the imagined version of a conversation is almost always worse than the version that actually happens. You walk into the real meeting terrified, and it turns out fine. Not because you were wrong to prepare, but because the version you rehearsed was built by the most anxious part of your mind, and anxious minds are terrible casting directors. They always give the other person the harshest possible line. There's also a quieter, more personal layer to this, one that has less to do with rehearsal and more to do with identity. Sometimes the imaginary conversation isn't about preparing for anything real at all. Sometimes it's about being someone, briefly, that you don't get to be in your actual life. The confident version of you who calls out the friend who keeps flaking. The composed version of you who finally sets a boundary with a parent instead of going quiet. These imagined scenes let you rehearse a self you're still building, trying it on the way you'd try on a jacket in a store before deciding whether it's really you. This is one of the reasons these daydreams can feel oddly satisfying even when nothing gets resolved. You're not just simulating a conversation, you're auditioning a version of your own personality, testing whether it fits. But there's a cost to running this machinery too often, and almost nobody talks about it, because on the surface, imaginary conversations look like productive thinking. They feel like problem solving. Your mind is working, generating dialogue, considering angles. It looks like effort, so it feels like progress. Except most of the time it isn't. It's motion without movement, like pedaling a stationary bike and mistaking the sweat for actual distance traveled. The giveaway is simple. If the imagined conversation changes anything about what you actually do afterward, it served its function. You rehearsed, you're ready, move on. But if you catch yourself running the same scene for the 5th night in a row, with no new information and no plan to act differently, that's no longer rehearsal. That's rumination wearing rehearsal's clothing. Same mechanism, opposite outcome. One prepares you for life, the other just keeps you circling above it, never landing. And this is where a lot of people quietly get stuck, because the two feel almost identical from the inside. Both involve imagining a conversation. Both involve emotion. Both feel important while they're happening. The only real difference is whether the loop is building toward an action or just replacing one. There's a way to tell which one you're in, and it has nothing to do with willpower. Ask what the imagined conversation is actually for. If you can name a real next step, a text you're going to send, a boundary you're going to set, a sentence you're finally going to say out loud tomorrow, the daydream is doing its job. If you can't name anything, if the scene just resets and plays again with no destination, your brain isn't preparing you for a moment anymore. It's stuck defending you from one that already passed, or one that may never come. This is also why the people you imagine arguing with most often aren't your enemies. They're usually people who matter to you. A parent, a partner, a boss you respect, a friend you don't want to lose. Because the brain doesn't waste this kind of processing power on relationships it doesn't care about. Nobody lies awake rehearsing a conversation with a barista who got their coffee order wrong. But a sibling who dismissed you at dinner 3 years ago? That conversation can run for a decade. The intensity of the replay is, in its own strange way, a measurement of how much you actually care about the outcome. So the next time you catch yourself mid-argument with someone who isn't in the room, gesturing at your steering wheel, muttering a comeback in the shower, rehearsing an apology to someone who has no idea you're even thinking about them, you don't have to feel embarrassed by it. You're not malfunctioning. You're doing something almost every human brain does, building a rough draft of a moment that matters to you, testing it before the real thing arrives, in case the real thing ever does. The only real question is what you do with the draft once you've written it, whether it becomes the version of the conversation you're brave enough to finally have, or just another take you file away and replay again tomorrow night. Which conversation do you keep having in your head that you still haven't had in real life, and what's actually stopping you from having it? If this changed how you think about your own mind, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this, turning the strange private things your brain does into something that finally makes sense.